paradrama tales.
My mom secretly used my inheritance to fund my sister's lavish wedding, but I froze the account. And what happened next left them speechless. How could a single act of financial betrayal expose so many family secrets and change everything overnight? When Dad first handed me that crisp manila envelope, he made it sound almost casual, like he was passing me a recipe card instead of the blueprint for my future. But inside lay the real secret, a meticulously structured trust, forged in the quiet hours of his hospital room, designed to protect every penny he'd dreamed of leaving me. Point 1. He'd placed the bulk of his estate, his share of the family real estate portfolio, savings accounts, and that modest Houston home, into a spendthrift trust, one I couldn't touch until I'd reached age 40, unless extraordinary circumstances arose. He'd shown me diagrams of how the trustee, an independent attorney he trusted implicitly, would dole out funds only for education, health care, or my own home purchase, never to line the pockets of a manipulator wielding tears and guilt as currency. Point 2. Nestled in the trust's fine print was a poison pill provision against anyone who tried to coerce inheritance for personal gain. If any beneficiary attempted to divert funds under false pretenses, medical emergencies that vanished into bridal gowns and centerpieces, for instance, the trustee could suspend distributions entirely. Dad chuckled through his pain when he told me, "Your mom won't see a dime unless you say so." I hadn't grasped the full power of that clause until weeks later, when I realized Mom had already spent thousands claiming Sarah's fake spinal surgery was urgent. With a single phone call, I watched her online access evaporate like steam, and her pleas turned to furious silence. Point 3. He had earmarked a fifth of the trust for a self-actualization fund, money expressly set aside for me to pursue my own passions, without obligation to bail anyone out. Those were his exact words. Use it to build your life, not fix mine. That clarity felt revolutionary. Dad knew, as did no one else, how I'd spent my childhood keeping the tenuous balance of our broken household intact, while Mom and Sarah siphoned off support checks meant for me. This fund was my chance to step out of that role forever. Sprinkled throughout the trust were subtle safeguards, a requirement that I meet annually with a financial counselor to reaffirm my goals, a careful ladder of disbursements that rewarded milestones, finishing therapy, buying a first home, even starting my own family. He'd even arranged for small, incremental ownership in his commercial properties, to vest only if I stayed engaged in my own career, not sidetracked by family dramas. It was Dad's final lesson. Protect yourself by building something unassailable. As I closed that envelope, a wave of both grief and empowerment washed over me. I'd lost him to cancer, yet he'd bequeathed far more than money. He'd given me autonomy. The trust's legal jargon suddenly felt like a lifeline, one woven with love and fierce foresight. It wasn't just a paper fortress. It was Dad's way of saying, "You matter more than our family's chaos." And in that moment, I understood. This secret in the trust would be the weapon I'd use to stop the cycle of manipulation and finally claim the life Dad always hoped I'd have. I first sensed something was off, not when the check for Sarah's emergency surgery cleared my new bank account, but the moment I saw Dream Day Events instead of St. Luke's Medical Center on the transaction slip. $15,000 vanished into thin air, earmarked for centerpieces and couture, not MRI machines. That was my first red flag. Next came the boutique charges, $10,000 for pre-ceremony fittings at La Belle Bride, when there was no bridal party in town, and those two payments to haute cuisine catering, still unopened envelopes of receipts sat in my glove compartment like evidence in a crime thriller. It felt absurd, but for years I'd been conditioned to believe my role was to pay without question. So I sat back, pulled on my investigator's cap, and dove down the rabbit hole. I started by tracing every cent, cross-referencing account statements, mapping vendor addresses, and cold-calling reception halls to see if they'd ever heard of a Wilson Barnes wedding. Every tip pointed to the same conclusion. My mother and sister had crafted an elaborate wedding fantasy masquerading as a medical necessity. But I didn't confront them yet. I needed proof. I logged into the Google Cloud Drive where they'd never bothered to change the password, uncovering dated emails from Mom to event planners. Yes, we'd love to book the grand ballroom for June 15th. Our budget is $80,000 total. That June date was 2 weeks after Sarah's surgery scheduled email to me, begging for the last $20,000. They'd built an entire itinerary, limo service, photo booths, fireworks license, none of which belonged in a hospital. While digging, another red flag surfaced. Mom's insistence on secrecy, telling me, "The doctor is a private specialist, mustn't delay." Yet, when I called the clinic, they had no record of my sister, no consulting fees on file. My blood ran cold. I documented every stonewall and every scripted tearful voicemail. "Please, this is for my daughter's life. It's all I have left. I'm so desperate." The desperation was real, but it wasn't medical. It was matrimonial. Then Sarah popped up on social media, joyfully announcing her engagement to Travis, the trust fund heir, 4 months before I ever heard of any relationship. My jaw dropped at a photo of her in a ball gown, captioned, "Counting down to forever." Glenn, their photographer, had tagged her business page. I reached out. No surgery mindset there, just wedding packages and happy hashtags. I'd handed them $35,000 under the guise of life or death medical need. Instead, they'd been planning a lavish reception for 200 of Travis's affluent friends and family. As I connected the dots, every seemingly minor inconsistency crystallized into a pattern of lies. The urgent $5,000 installment for special equipment went to Lux Flower Co. The deposit for the surgeon was actually a deposit for the 5-piece jazz ensemble they'd booked. Phone calls that were supposed to be about anesthesia turned out to be vendor negotiations for a chocolate fountain. I saved screenshots of calendar invites titled "Bridal Party Tasting" and forwarded invoices from a wedding DJ. My dollars had DJ'd their deceit. With each discovery, my resolve hardened. This wasn't just a heartbreak, it was theft under false pretenses. I assembled a digital dossier of shout-by-shout details, transaction records, email threads, vendor confirmations. My chest tightened every time I clicked save on another damning file. I knew once this evidence set off its own chain reaction, I wouldn't be able to rewind. But I also knew it was the only way to stop the cycle of manipulation that had twisted my family's bonds into financial bondage. The rabbit hole had delivered me to the edge of truth, and I was ready to pull them all down with it. By the time I first froze the account, the wedding machine was already in full swing, and I had only the skimpiest sense of its scope. The telltale sign came when Dream Day Events emailed to confirm the final $12,000 installment for the grand ballroom. Their confirmation code matched the one on my bank statement. I forwarded the invoice to the venue manager and laid out the truth. These funds were transferred under false pretenses. 2 days later, I watched as the caterer called my mother in fury, demanding their deposit back or they'd cancel her date. When the florist's Instagram post dropped petals on a 300-stem order, I alerted them they'd been duped. Suddenly, every vendor I'd traced began pulling out. Days before the big day, and tanks started rolling through my family's polished facade. Mom's first reaction was denial. She claimed a banking error, then blamed the hacker she imagined was targeting their wedding. But as I released the contracts I'd secured, signed by Mom on hotel letterhead, stamped by the florist hired for centerpieces, the truth stacked up in cold, undeniable rows. I uploaded spreadsheets of every transaction. $8,450 to Lux Flower Espacidas, $6,200 to Haute Bridal Couture, $15,000 to Dream Day Events, $9,700 to Poor Decisions Bartending, all marked medical emergency. Her face when she scrolled through it was pure horror, like a ghost realizing its own reflection. Next, I confronted Sarah over video chat. In the blue glow of her bridal boutique's fitting room, she claimed ignorance. "I thought Mom was handling it," she stammered. "I had no idea it wasn't medical funds." Her dress swished behind her, pearl white, beaded, $4,500 retail price. I held my tongue, letting her story unravel as I played back the vendor emails confirming bridal alterations and dance floor lighting. She went silent, her mouth parted like a wounded bird. Then came the smear campaign, a twisted pushback from my own mother. Suddenly, I was the villain online. Greedy son steals his sister's wedding dreams. Read a flurry of family Facebook comments. My phone lit up with messages from distant aunts I hadn't heard from in years, calling me heartless and ungrateful. Mom blasted out group texts. He destroyed everything. They left out the part about $45,000 stolen via false medical claims, but the damage was immediate. My reputation in the family was now the collateral, but my evidence was airtight. I released selected snippets, redacted for privacy, to the key decision makers at every vendor, the band, the caterer, the luxury hotel. When the jazz trio asked for restitution, my mother's pleas turned frantic. Her texts begged me to relent. Just this once. Sarah pleaded via voicemail, her voice quivering. "You owe me this day." I played them back for clarity. She'd literally wanted a day funded by lies. In the meltdown that followed, Mom tried to remortgage her house to rescue the wedding. Her credit hit the ceiling long ago. Sarah's fiancé Travis's family withdrew entirely, their lawyers threatening defamation suits if she didn't return their deposits. The perfect scam had exposed cracks so deep even her loyal flying monkeys couldn't shore them up. Their world of deceit imploded, and I sat back, hands folded, watching as years of manipulation unraveled in real time, not out of spite, but out of necessity. Sometimes the only way to stop a con is to shine a light so bright it burns away every lie. By the time the bank's fraud department called to confirm my freeze order, the house of cards my mom and sister had built was already toppling, and I watched it all unfold in real time. Late one evening, I logged into my online portal and hit freeze account. Every joint and trust fund link severed with a click, then leaned back as the system processed my command. Instantly, vendors began calling my mother in a panic. First the caterer, then the florist. Even the limo service rang her landline, all demanding payment for deposits long since cleared. Overnight, the portraits of a rosy future, 5-course menus, custom gowns, string quartets, cracked into shards. My mother's text messages shifted from feigned confusion, "There must be a mistake," to outright fury. "How dare you ruin my daughter's wedding?" While Sarah's pleas landed via voicemail. "I can't believe you do this to me." I documented every cry for mercy, every desperate negotiation attempt to unfreeze the funds. The local newspaper, even a few nosy neighbors, caught wind of a canceled wedding drama, though no one knew the real story. That $75,000 of inheritance meant for my family's future had been funneled into an event no one would now attend. As the fallout spread, my phone buzzed with messages from relatives once eager to RSVP. Aunts demanded explanations. Uncles condemned me as brutally unsympathetic. But once I forwarded the actual bank statements, lines of transactions labeled medical emergency, flowing directly into wedding vendor accounts, the tone shifted. Some called to apologize. Others hung up on me. The banking freeze triggered legal notices. Vendors threatened to sue if they weren't paid, while my mom muttered about blackmail and betrayal. Sarah tried one last gambit, begging me to just release enough funds to save the band. But by then, I had grown numb to the theatrics. Instead, I directed her to the same spreadsheets I'd shared with each vendor, every dollar accounted for, every lie exposed. In those days, I learned just how far family will go when cornered. My mom resorted to calling my boss, claiming her son had lost his mind. And my dad's widow, Janet, received panicked calls accusing her of orchestrating the meltdown. Even my local church was roped in. Mom pleaded for a benevolence fund to cover what she called Sarah's special medical needs. I watched her humiliation simmer behind her bravado. Her voice cracked when she realized there was no sympathetic wallet left to tap. Meanwhile, Sarah's fiancé quietly slipped away, his family unwilling to foot a scandal-ridden wedding bill. I learned that when you freeze the flow of money, you also freeze the mask of love that some wore so well. And yet, amidst the chaos, a strange clarity took hold. For years, I'd measured my worth by how much I could give, until I understood that refusing to fund deceit was the truest gift I could give myself. The drips of accusations, the legal threats, the lost invitations, all of it paled next to the relief of knowing I would never again be someone's emergency ATM. When the last vendor confirmed their contract cancellation and the final vendor check was returned, I closed the bank app and felt a weight lift from my shoulders. The freeze was not just a financial maneuver, it was the decisive act that shattered a toxic cycle and forced my family to face the consequences of their choices. In the end, the only thing left frozen was their ability to exploit me, and for the first time in decades, I felt truly free. When I saw the panic in my mother's voice as she realized her bridal empire was crumbling, I knew it was time to flip the script, and so I did. With every vendor in turmoil and Sarah's fiancé calling off the engagement, I harnessed the same precision I'd once used to quietly document every false medical invoice and wedding deposit. And I pressed send on a carefully crafted email to the entire extended family. In that message, I laid out the timeline. First, the trust disbursements earmarked for my future, then the succession of urgent transfers to Dream Day events, Lux Bloom's florist, grand ballroom rentals, and every other luxury vendor who smiled for Sarah's photo op. I embedded screenshots of bank statements, vendor contracts, and even my mom's own tearful text, admitting she'd lied to secure the venue. I didn't once add my own commentary. I let the cold, hard data speak volumes. Within hours, the family group chat ignited. Some aunts gasped in horror, demanding answers. Uncles quietly apologized in private. Cousins who'd once RSVP'd eagerly to the wedding announced they'd never show. Even my father's widow, Janet, reached out to express relief that the truth was finally out. The vendors, too, sent polite thank you notes for clarifying the fraud, and a few local news outlets sniffed around the canceled Houston ballroom scandal. But I shrugged off any attention. I wasn't seeking pity or headlines, just accountability. Meanwhile, my mom's threats of ruining my reputation fell flat when relatives forwarded her own emails confessing, "We need this money," as they arranged an $80,000 affair under the guise of life-saving surgery. Sarah's pleas for forgiveness echoed in my voicemail, but without the mask of financial power, her words rang hollow. Then came the legal coup de grace. I filed formal complaints with the wedding contract arbitration boards and notified the state's attorney general of potential financial exploitation. I offered my mom and sister a final chance to return 100% of the misappropriated inheritance by month's end or face civil proceedings for breach of fiduciary duty and fraud. As the deadline loomed, I watched helpless faces on Zoom calls morph from defiance to desperation. Mom abandoned her usual crocodile tears and resorted to silence. Sarah tried bartering. "I'll work extra shifts," she sobbed, but I refused to negotiate with her conscience. This was never about the money. It was about restoring boundaries I'd spent decades without. On the final day, a swift resolution arrived. Electronic transfers covering the outstanding balance, accompanied by an email from my mom's lawyer, pledging no further recourse. As I watched the numbers tick back into my account, I felt a remarkable shift. The power dynamic had reversed. No longer the Good Samaritan bleeding for everyone else's drama. I was once again in control, protecting the legacy my father entrusted to me, honoring his wish that his hard-earned wealth serve my family's future, not a sham celebration. Walking away from my frozen wedding fiasco, I realized I hadn't just turned the tables, I'd dismantled the entire game board, proving that sometimes the most liberating act of kindness is the courage to say, "Not this time." By the time the last wire from Mom's lawyer cleared my bank account, I felt something loosen inside me, as if I'd been shackled to a drama I never auditioned for. And those chains had finally snapped. It wasn't just the cold click of available balance that set me free. It was the realization that financial autonomy is the bedrock of self-respect. For years, I'd believed that keeping the peace meant being everyone's unpaid therapist and emergency fund. But when a 38-year-old man has to subpoena his own family's greed, something fundamental shifts in your psyche. Boundaries cease to be walls and become bridges to healthier relationships. First, I reclaim my time. No more 2 a.m. calls begging for bailouts, no more errands on family command. I scheduled phone calls with friends instead, set Do Not Disturb on my bank lines, and let my phone's voicemail filter out the hailstorm of the guilt trips. Studies show that clear boundaries reduce anxiety by up to 40%, a fact I felt coursing through my bones as I leaned back in my chair, sipping coffee in sunlight rather than dread. Next, I honored my father's legacy. He'd designed that trust not as a revolving door for Mom's whims, but as seed capital for my dreams and for my children's. I finally moved forward on the property investment seminar he'd always encouraged me to attend, turning grief into growth. I reviewed my portfolio, met with my financial advisor, and earmarked part of the inheritance for my daughter's college fund, an act of stewardship that felt like a quiet tribute to a man who waited decades to give me the power to choose. Finally, I rebuilt my chosen family. My wife, Rachel, had stood steadfast through every crisis, her counsel steady and clear. We booked a weekend retreat with friends, people who never called asking for handouts, but who asked, "How are you?" with genuine concern. We laughed on hiking trails instead of whining through more family drama. And when I looked around that campfire, I realized that kinship isn't defined by blood, but by mutual respect and shared joy. Breaking free wasn't a single act of freezing accounts or email reveals. It was a process of reclaiming my agency, anchoring myself in facts, my father's wishes, my therapist's advice, the science of healthy boundaries, and weaving them into a narrative that no longer revolved around other people's expectations. If you've ever found yourself bleeding out for a family that treats you like an ATM, know this. The moment you draw your own line, you give others permission to see you as whole, not as a resource. It might shatter old patterns, but that crack lets your own light in. And sometimes the bravest thing you can do is to say, "I'm not yours to use. I belong to myself." When I finally hit send on the mass email titled "The Truth About Our Family Finances," I felt the same adrenaline chill I'd experienced the night I froze our account, but magnified tenfold. I'd spent days meticulously gathering every shred of proof, bank statements showing the inheritance transfers, screenshots of my mother's tearful pleas for medical emergencies, contracts from the wedding vendors listing dates and deposits, even transcribed recordings of Sarah bragging to Travis's relatives about my brother's money. My fingers hesitated only a moment before I sent the dossier to 60 relatives, all the way from Aunt Linda in Ohio to Uncle Mike in California. No more private pleas and delayed excuses. This was public, legal, and irreversible. Almost instantly, replies poured in, some in stunned silence, some with frantic apologies, others accusing me of betraying the family. A few distant cousins thanked me for revealing the scam, admitting they'd suspected something after seeing Sarah's impossibly lavish Instagram photos. Meanwhile, back at home, my phone rang with unfamiliar blocked numbers, likely Mom's lawyer or Sarah's frantic texts. I ignored them. A week later, the fallout was undeniable. Dream Day events demanded a full refund. The Grand Ballroom canceled Sarah's booking and threatened legal action against my mother for fraud. The boutique called to say they were filing a civil suit for non-payment. The whispers in the neighborhood eventually turned into open gossips. Neighbors who'd seen the charity gala, where Sarah pretended to mourn Dad, now shook their heads in sympathy for me, not for her. My sister's engagement was quietly called off. Her fiancé's family quietly texted Rachel and me apologies for having been misled. My mother, once the architect of relentless guilt trips, found herself the subject of pitying glances at the diner where she'd once ruled the scene. The trust Dad had set up in Texas law proved airtight. I could not be coerced, and any legal challenge would only expose the elaborate deceit in court. As word spread, a few more relatives reached out privately to express remorse. Some offered to help Sarah with legitimate medical bills, suggesting a community inbox instead of my personal account. I let them know I would release a modest contribution once proper documentation was provided, and only once. But for the most part, the silence from my own blood was deafening. That absence, more than any lawsuit or financial restitution, felt like the true reckoning. It was a reckoning not just of cash, but of trust, respect, and the conditional love they had offered me for 38 years. My final acts were both symbolic and practical. I closed the account they'd maxed out, transferred Dad's inheritance into a series of long-term investments for my children, and updated my will to ensure no one could ever exploit my generosity again. Then I sat on my porch at dusk, a legal document in hand, formally renouncing any familial obligation to my mother and sister beyond what Texas child law required, and mailed it to them via certified return receipt. The next morning, I woke to the physical envelope in my mailbox, unopened, unacknowledged, alongside a card from Janet, my stepmother, that read, "Dad always believed in you. I always will." In that moment, I realized that justice isn't always about courtroom drama. Sometimes it's the quiet severing of toxic ties, the peace that comes when manipulative voices finally fade into silence, and the knowledge that you have reclaimed your life and your inheritance, exactly as Dad intended. When the dust finally settled and my sister's wedding dreams lay in ruins, I realized that the greatest inheritance Dad left me wasn't the $350,000 in his trust. It was the brutal clarity of what love and money must never become. First, money is not love. I'd grown up believing that my worth to my family was measured in dollars. The rent I paid, the bills I covered, the bailouts I launched like life rafts. But when they swallowed every cent without a second thought, I saw that generosity had been mistaken for weakness. True love doesn't come with an invoice. It shows up unconditionally, without expecting a receipt or refund. Second, boundaries are acts of self-respect. All those years I let texts, late-night calls, and guilt-trip monologues dictate my every dollar, I was my own captive. Freezing the account felt ruthless at the time, but it taught me that saying no to unhealthy demands is not cruelty. It's preservation. Setting clear financial limits didn't make me a villain. It reclaimed my autonomy and allowed me to love my wife, my children, and even my father's memory without being their shadow ATM. Third, transparency is the bedrock of trust. Dad's trust documents were locked down so tightly that even Mom's best legal tricks couldn't pry them open. He'd designed his legacy not just as an inheritance, but as a system that protected my heart and wallet. In the months that followed, whenever I hesitated to share every detail of the scam with my relatives, I reminded myself that honesty, even when painful, illuminates the path forward. By emailing relatives the full dossier, I risked family chaos, but I also broke the cycle of secret-keeping and shame. What surprised me most was how many aunts and uncles whispered thank you once they saw the truth. They'd suspected oddities, but never had the courage to confront them. Those whispered words reminded me that vulnerability is stronger than silence. In the end, my real victory wasn't in halting a fraudulent wedding or recouping thousands of dollars. It was in learning that money can amplify your worst wounds if you misuse it, or it can cement your greatest values if you steward it wisely. Love without boundaries becomes codependency. Generosity without discernment becomes exploitation. Secrecy without accountability becomes betrayal. As I watched Mom and Sarah scramble to salvage their lives, scraping together loans and begging distant relatives, the lessons crystallized. Wealth is a tool, not a tether. Boundaries are gifts you give yourself. And transparency is the compass that keeps family from drifting into darkness. Dad's final gift wasn't a check. It was the blueprint for integrity. And as I invested his inheritance in my children's future, I vowed to teach them the love and money, when handled with respect and honesty, can coexist, but never at the expense of the other. When the last echoes of fraud and fury finally faded, I stood alone in the quiet of my home, the weight of what had happened settling like dust after a storm. I thought I'd be angry, truly enraged, but instead, I felt an unexpected calm, a sense of peace that comes only when you've shed something heavy at last. For years, I carried the burden of being the provider, the reliable ATM, the one who showed up on cue to keep my mother's house, my sister's dreams, and my own family functioning. Yet none of those sacrifices counted when they counted me out. Freezing that inheritance account was a moment of reckoning, but the true reward came afterward, a renewed understanding of my own worth, unmoored from their demands. I learned that real strength is not in how much you can give, but in how well you know when to stop giving. I discovered that standing up for yourself with compassion rather than anger creates room not just for your voice, but for genuine healing. And I realized that transparency, though it can fracture old bonds, also forges new connections rooted in honesty and respect. Now, when I gather with my wife and children around the dinner table, the plates no longer bear the weight of obligations I secretly shouldered. Instead, they hold laughter, shared stories, and plans for the future we build together. My father's legacy lives on, not in the numerical sum credited to my account, but in the blueprint he left for integrity, the trust that protects us, the boundaries that guide us, and the love that costs nothing more than a full heart. If there's one truth I can share with you, whether you're watching this from your cozy living room or reflecting on your own family stories, it's this: wealth without wisdom can become a burden, but wisdom without wealth may never find its wings. Choose your boundaries, choose honesty, and choose to honor yourself first so you can truly honor those you love. If my journey resonates with you, if you've ever felt used or overlooked, share your story in the comments below. Let's create a space where we lift each other up. And don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell for more stories of courage, family, and the power of standing firm. Your voice matters, and together, we'll keep turning life's toughest lessons into the most powerful legacies.